Okay, this is the Power Compression course preview class. We're going to start by looking at class number 1 preview, and this is on dynamics processing. So a little primer here on dynamics processing. I just want to go into some of the basics of what dynamics processing is, a little bit of a history about it, the 4 basic types of dynamics processing, parameters of the dynamics processors, and dynamics in the 3D sound field. So that's a lot of material. And while what I can do is I can give like just a kind of quick overview for what this is all about. And I guess I'll just kind of start here on the sketchboard and kind of doodle a little bit and kind of go over some basic things. Now, in terms of dynamics processing, what we're really doing is we're controlling a bunch of different aspects of the sound. One of the things that and maybe this isn't the first thing to put, was that we're controlling performance, right? We're controlling the consistency of performance. Now, dynamics processing has always been sort of an edgy topic with people. There are people who just want to compress the snot out of everything. There are people who think that compression is, the root of all evil, right? There should be laws against compression and things like that. And somewhere in the middle is the truth here for what's going on. And really, when you break down what dynamics processing are all about, it's all about controlling performances. Now, why would you want to control performances, and why is that so important? Well, when things are tracked, especially in the modern multi-track era of recording, so I think when you get really effectively mid-70s and later, where everything is pretty much 16 track, 24 track. By the 80s, mid-late 80s, you're all 48 track. And then in the 90s, all the way up to 96 track. And then you're into the DAW world, which is basically just as many tracks as you can squeeze into your CPU. So I think the more tracks that you have, what happens, or what ends up happening, is that you get less live full performances. And there's still a lot of that stuff that's done. However, even back in the days of analog tape, if you were 16 track or 24 track, you would have a whole tracking session with maybe a full band. But out of that, you may only want to keep the drums, and then you're going to re-record the bass and re-record the guitars and re-record the vocals and solos and keyboards and all the other stuff that go along with that. And the problem when you layer parts on is that, like this, is that people do not have the ability to really to respond to each other. There's no visual. There's no being in the same room with the person. In other words, part of capturing performances in a studio and getting them to be really good is basically to get everybody in the same frame of mind, with the same focus and the same ideas and the same intent on what the song should be and how it should lay out. And over the course of a performance, if you did it 10 times, all 10 performances would be very different from each other. Now, to some, it might be exactly the same. To people who really listen, though, there would be a feel, a groove, a sense of like, yeah, we really clicked with this take, okay? And when you get past that and you sort of take away that aspect of it, of the interaction, direct relationship, and you start layering on parts, now what happens is that the performances become less responsive, because when you're laying that bass part over a cool drum beat, it's like you don't hear any of the other parts in the song, right? You don't hear what the vocal is saying, right? You're writing and you're composing something and you're putting something together from scratch, but the parts aren't really responding or as responsive to each other. Okay, and no matter how much programming work that you do, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to kind of build in. Now, especially when you dub in live performers, this gets to be even more tricky, because they can only respond to what it is that they hear. Okay, and as a result, what happens is there are 2 problems that happen in performances. One is that they are too dynamic, meaning that they are inconsistent or uneven. And this is actually a big problem, because here, if you have certain sections where certain notes are way too loud and other notes are not loud enough, and really what you were getting was the performer just trying to make that note and they were hitting it too hard. So we have things that are too dynamic or inconsistent, maybe is, a better way to put it. And now inconsistent in terms of the gain, okay, and that's important, not in terms of the timing, because that's a whole other thing, and that gets into editing. Okay, so the inconsistency is there, or the other problem is the performances are too flat, meaning that they're too linear. There's no excitement. So in other words, maybe because the performer who's playing the bass only has the drums to listen to, he's not as dynamic as he might be as if he heard all the guitar parts and the vocal and the guitar solo, and he would be responding dynamically to that. And a really good producer in getting these performances out of people goes about the process of trying to really focus them and say, hey, this section's going to be really big. I need you to be really pushing it, here in this section, and driving them to get as much as the juice as they can out of them. So you would think that compression is only about controlling these aspects. It takes those areas that are too dynamic and makes them less dynamic. It takes the inconsistent areas and makes them more consistent. Okay, but dynamics processing can also take things that are too flat and make them more dynamic. Okay, so when we talk about dynamics processing, we often think just of compression. We think of like, well, we're dealing with compression. We're dealing with controlling gain. It's like, but controlling gain doesn't mean that you're necessarily flattening it out. Okay, it could mean that you're making it move or groove or breathe more. And that's an important part of making things work. Now, dynamics processors can be used for in a variety of different ways. Compressors are primarily, used most in terms of the controlling of dynamics. Okay, so compression is really, obviously the most popular and what we're going to really focus on. We also have limiting, and limiting is just a variation of compression. The only primary difference being is the ratio, right? So if the ratio goes beyond a certain number, then effectively you're getting into limiting. And this really extends more from the broadcast world. And most of the really great bus compressors that we see come, like the Fairchild, come from the broadcast world. That's what they were created for. And then they were adapted for use in recording studios as, hey, like this is here. This sounds really cool. Let's use it. And, and it served a valuable purpose. We also have expansion. And expansion is, and primarily, for most of the history, expansion was really used for the purpose of gating. Okay, in other words, we're trying to remove noise. We're trying to extract noise. So we might apply a gate on a snare drum so that we can minimize the amount of hi-hat bleed that's coming in. So that would be a classic thing. Or maybe a similar type of thing with a kick drum. If the kick drum mic was outside of the kick drum, where it would pick up more cymbal noise and things like that. So gates were a big part, but there are many, many, many other forms of dynamic processing. There's different forms of compression. There's upward compression and downward compression. There's upward expansion and downward expansion. And those are the four basic types, and they can be manipulated in different ways. They can be chopped up into different frequency bands to be made multi-band and work within specific frequency areas. There's so many different ways that we can control the dynamics of things. Sometimes it's just getting rid of stuff that we don't want. Sometimes it's accentuating or making things more consistent. And these are the techniques that we're basically going to learn here. So in terms of the history of processing, of dynamics processing, it really stems back to the broadcast industry and the film industry, but particularly the broadcast industry, because this is where the need for keeping things even kind of came about. And for the most part, in early broadcasts, your engineer would be essentially writing a gain control manually, or writing, I don't think even back then everything was a rotary pot. It was a knob. There weren't faders or linear sliders until I think the 60s. So this wasn't like, a common thing. And so you were basically following the dynamic and trying to anticipate what was happening. And in the recording stage, this is really difficult, because as an engineer going to a cutting lathe, that's a really, really big deal. But over time, some people, broadcast engineers, would kind of look and say, you know what, this is a pain in the neck. I need to find something that will kind of help do this and will do it more efficiently. And so you started to see processors that used tubes as a form of compression, or optical components as a form of compression. And these things were built into units, many of which are really, really popular today, or solid state components were later used in the 70s, late 60s, and early 70s, that offered, faster and more reactive dynamics processing. And FET compressors came in, and that made it really fast. And VCAs were developed in the 70s. And all these technologies to help control dynamic. These things were also used, a lot of dynamics processing was developed by noise reduction systems, right? So they would take these dynamics processing concepts, and they would use them as a way of getting rid of noise. Not necessarily by gating, or not in the term that you would call gating, but in the form of expansion. So like a basic, very, very basic, a noise reduction system, if you had, say, like a tape machine in the middle and you were recording to tape, you knew that you would have like a certain amount of tape hiss on playback, and that might be at like minus 60 in terms of level, and then 0 would be your top level. So if you know what the dynamic range of your music is, and let's say it's about 60 dB, if you recorded it without compression, it would come back and the lowest level information would be in the noise, or right at the noise floor. So if you compressed everything by 2:1, and then on the backstage expanded it by an inverse ratio of 1:2, then you would take the dynamic range and make it from 60 dB to 30 dB, and on playback at 30 dB, expand it back out to 60 dB, and what you would effectively do is push the noise down, right? So this is another form of dynamics processing, right? Called a compander, a compressor expander, right? Equal and opposite. And these are techniques that were widely used. Now, the four basic types, of compression or dynamics processing that exist, and this is like dreadful. Hold on. Okay, I can do better than this. I just have to go slower, so we have to lay off the caffeine here, or kind of four types of dynamics processing. I'll just put a little DYN here. DYNPROC. That's where we'll go. Okay, so the first type and the most popular type is downward compression. And downward compression is a form of compression where you work at signals above a threshold. So when a signal passes above a threshold, then a compression process or a gain reduction process is enacted by whatever means, and the overall gain is lowered. Or the gain above threshold. So that triggers the compression or limiting to occur, and then the gain is brought down as a result. Two is, and the second most popular is downward expansion. And downward expansion works in a very similar way, only it works at below a threshold. So when a signal passes below a threshold, it is sent down farther. And that's the basic idea. So that's the downward compression aspect. So downward compression, above threshold, downward expansion, it moves the signal downward. Now, in more recent years, we've gotten some very cool new tools, many that are a result of, computers and plugins and digital technology, where basically everything can be worked as math, and that is upward compression. Now, in upward compression, we're working with a low-level threshold, so signals below the threshold are raised in gain. Okay, so when a signal falls below, or a certain amount of signal exists below a set threshold, the low-level upward compression will bring that gain up and make it more audible. So it's a way of pulling things up and making them more audible. This is a very powerful way of sometimes called low-level compression, of bringing in presence into a sound, because most of that presence energy exists in the lower realm. And then the other one is upward expansion. And upward expansion is a very cool way of taking materials that are audio signals that are passing above threshold, just like a compressor, but instead of compressing it by, say, a 2:1 ratio, you expand it by maybe a 0.5:1 ratio or a 1:2 ratio, however you want to put it. So the signal above threshold can then be raised even higher. And this is a way of, you see it most in like some of these transient controlling plugins where the transient is enhanced, right? It's a way of making the transient punchier. And this is really good for working with overcompressed material. These four basic types form the foundation of a lot of the dynamics processing that we're going to go over in this course and set the foundation for everything. They all basically works on the same principles. Now, and same basic settings. So what are the settings, or maybe instead of settings, let's just say what are the parameters that you will see. Now, the parameters have actually changed over the course of years because, not all compressors had things like threshold, or the threshold was fixed. Not all of them had ratio controls. You just got whatever the limiter was set at. That's just whatever its function was at. You didn't always have attack and release settings. So these were important things. But if we looked at the basic settings that you will see on all dynamics processors, for the most part, let's just, say outside of vintage stuff, threshold is the first. So because this is going to determine what signal is being actually processed, is triggering the gain reduction or triggering the expansion. So with threshold, whether it's signals above threshold or below threshold, either way, it's the same basic process. So we have threshold. We have the attack time. Now, the attack time is really critical because the attack time determines how long it will take after the signal is passed above threshold for the gain reduction to start to occur. So if you slow down the attack, you can allow the transient to pass through unaffected and then compress or control the gain of the signals afterwards. Thus, in a way, the compressor now acts as a method of increasing dynamic range because relatively that peak would now stand out higher from the sustained element of the sound, whereas a fast attack would then cut down on that transient peak. The release time is very important. The release time determines how long the signal will be held onto before returning to non-gain reduced signal. So once the threshold is exceeded, the attack time is applied, the gain reduction is applied, and how long does it take to release or return to non-gain reduced signal? So the faster the release, the more the signal will pump and move, the more open perhaps the sound will be. The slower the release time, the smoother the sound will be overall. The ratio determines how heavily or severely that signal is processed. So when you work with the ratio control, you're setting the ratio based on what it is that you want to accomplish. So maybe if you want to do like a general smoothing, you can set a low threshold, fast attack, fast release, and a very low ratio. And what that does is the compression will act very will be compressing consistently, and there'll be some movement in there because of the speed of the attack and release, but the low ratio will keep the amount of gain reduction to a relatively minimal amount. So maybe it's 3 or 4 dB of gain reduction total, but it doesn't really move beyond that, even though the signal may be 30, 40 dB above threshold. Okay, so those things are really important. And the relationship of all of these creates a ridiculous amount of possibilities. So one of the other things that you'll see is a knee control. And what the knee is sort of like, the quick way of thinking about a knee is sort of like a crossfade control for your ratio. So it's sort of a subset of the ratio control. How aggressively is it applied? So if you have 2-to-1, is it like 2-to-1 instantly, right at the onset of attack, or does it sort of crossfade it in? Okay, and this is a characteristic that helps to smooth out compression. So if you've heard of soft knee compressors, really that term was made popular by DBX with the release of the 160X, which was a follow-up to the DBX 160, which was a hard knee compressor, as were most compressors during that time. So the knee is basically how aggressively the ratio is applied to the audio signal. So there's absolutely a connection there. Now, when you get into gates and expanders, you will also find a hold control. Now, the hold control is a length of time that the signal is held onto before the release cycle is begun. So this is sort of a subset of release, or part of the release characteristic. So in other words, if the threshold say it's, for example, a gate, and the signal passes above threshold, the gate opens, it holds on to it for 250 milliseconds, and then a 250 millisecond release brings it back down to whatever the floor is. So these are settings that you will have. So with the threshold settings, there are also multiple thresholds. Sometimes on gates, you'll have an open threshold and a closed threshold. And the closed threshold is on a gate. So the signal uses the open threshold to open. So now the gate is open. But now the closed threshold quite often is lower than the open threshold, so that you have more control over the release. So example, if you had, say, a floor tom, if you hit it softly and the sustain only lasts this long, you want the gate to close after this amount of time. But if he hits it harder and the sustain lasts this long, then what you want to do is you want to have it so that the gate holds on or doesn't start its close cycle until the sustain decays enough there. And therefore, it becomes more interactive or more musical. Now, there are other more sophisticated controls. You'll see terms that we will include, like a range control. These are basically variations on these basic themes here. And we'll get into some of the ways that these different things can be used and how they interact and all of that sort of stuff as part of the course. So those are the basics from that end. Let's see if I just missed anything. Oh, one other thing, this is actually a pretty rich class, is the 3D sound field. Part of the, or the most significant part about dynamics processing is the front-back movement that occurs when working with compressors. And this is such an important part. When I work with functional compression, which we're going to get into, we're going to be talking about how you set a stage. So in other words, if a signal is coming from far away from you, say on the other side of a room, all right, so let's escape the mix for a second, although it'll work perfectly analogous. If the sound is far away from you, as it travels toward you, the transient signal will lose the most amount of energy relative to the rest of the signal. There will also be some signal frequency response loss. So if you want something to stand a little bit back in the mix, using a fast attack helps to achieve that. Whereas if you had something that was right up front, then the transient would be at its sharpest right in front of you. All right, so you would hear all of the articulation, all of the detail. So to make something move forward, you would slow down the attack, allow the transient signal to push through, and then the gain reduction would occur after to control the movement. Now, this is not a static thing. So if you set a fast attack, it doesn't set this back here, because relative to that, the release characteristic creates some front-back movement relative to that positioning, okay? And so relative to the attack time setting, you're going to get some movement up and down, back and forth. And this is because in the world of mixing, in terms of the two-dimensional sound field of front-back panning or movement, right? So we have left-right, which is our normal panning. That's just with a pan pot. That's really simple. And front back is our level control, our fader control. So what we have with dynamics processing is basically a dynamic fader level control, a dynamic gain control. So if you want something to sound more up front, you raise the fader level, it sounds louder, and now it sounds closer to you. If you make the acoustic guitar louder than the electric, it'll sound like it's in front of the electric. Okay, if you now enhance that by putting a fast attack on the electric and a slow attack on the acoustic, you've now created more separation. But the release time now becomes musical. So if the release time has like a musical mathematical value that's related to the beats per minute, then the movement becomes musical. So that slight movement back and forth, as rapid as it may be, moves back and forth in a musical timing, and that helps to enhance the performance, the quality of the performance. So you could see how things start to get together. So this is the very basics of it, and so much of this works based on frequency response characteristics as well. So when you do certain levels of this, and you start to do, just like say you just did basic levels and you just did compression, you will only get a certain amount of movement, right? So the fast attack, short attack setting will give you a certain amount of movement from maybe here to here in terms of a distance. And then when you use the EQ to maybe roll off or warm up the high frequencies, you can make this go back a little bit farther. Or if you brighten or intensify the high mids and high frequencies, it'll come a little bit closer toward you. When you start to add in early reflections, which create the sense of 3D, then it will create a little bit more. It'll enhance that as well. So as you put on each layer of processing, it has to kind of stack on to the goal that you're trying to create with it. So nothing works on its own, but together, when you move them all together, you will all of a sudden get this sense of depth and openness and size that didn't exist. Size is not a frequency thing. It's a spatial environmental thing. And that one of the most powerful controls for front-back movement is compression. And so that's really where you're going to see its most powerful use in vivid detail in the course. You know, when you start to get to multi-band processors and you can apply those principles to high frequencies or high mid frequencies, you can actually help to move things up and down as well as front and back. And you start to get into all of these different characteristics blended together, and then all of a sudden it becomes very clear that you can have an incredible amount of control over what it is that you're doing, you know, with sound. So that's a basic preview of Class 1, and maybe the most verbal of all of them in terms of the information, because it's just like a volume, a huge amount of information right there. And we'll get into this in much more vivid detail in the actual class. So that's Class 1 preview. Let's move on to Class number 2.